How are we doing this morning? My name is Dan, the Jazz Shepherd. Uh, it's Friday morning, and we're going to talk about some more recent releases. I'd like to finish that series on the small labels that sprung up during the 50s with the 10-inch era, in the LP era, but I'm trying to boost the viewership a little bit, so we're going to do another episode on stuff I've been playing in the cafe the last week and a half. The last episode I did was on the best jazz record that most people don't have. And a few people told me they had it. And a few people also said they didn't have it. I guess the majority of you said you didn't have it. I mean, the majority of you didn't comment, don't have it. And it's not surprising. It's not a very well publicized recording, the Dizzy Gillespie Afro. But take my word for it. It's fundamental. It's foundational. It's rolling thunder. It's just fantastic. And those who have it can testify. I mean, they'll tell you how great that record is. And so many of these jazz artists that were legends and greats have this seminal album that everyone has. And this should be Dizzy's. This should be the one that Dizzy exists in everyone's collection. It's just marvelous. And the players on it, the recordings, the arrangements, the propulsion of it. But I was I mean, I said a few people said they had it, but a lot of people didn't say nothing, which to me says they didn't have it, and so they didn't say nothing. But I'm guessing my assumption is true, that most jazz fans who think of themselves as pretty hardcore jazz fans don't have that record. And by the lack of times I've seen it posted in the groups and on the YouTube channels, that would also attest to that fact. Today I'm going to talk to you later in this episode about what might be the greatest jazz song of all time. And of course, that's a very difficult question to even... I never come to these moments looking for what's the greatest jazz song, what's the best jazz record people don't have. It's just listening to it, I'm like, wow, this might be the best jazz record that most people don't have. And this song, whenever I play it, I'm always just so moved by it. It's such an incredible documentation of what jazz is. And in a test tube, it's a vacuum sealed product that could absolutely knock your socks off. And it's relatable through generations and decades. And I mean, we'll get to that a little bit. First, let's dive into what we've been listening to the last 9 days or so. Oh, I love coffee. So first and foremost, Clifford Brown and Max Roach. And this is on the GNP label, a West Coast label. Gene Norman was a concert promoter. And some of the concerts he promoted, he recorded. And so that's how he ends up with recordings of some of the great groups of that time that weren't really on his label per se. But it's Clifford Brown and Max Roach, and if memory serves, it's got Harold Land, Morrow, and Richie Powell. I mean, the whole group's there. I think it's from '54, maybe '53, but I'm pretty sure it's '54. A small little label that he produced, somewhat like Norman Granz. He was a concert impresario, and you can see Clifford on the back there. You can see a young Max Roach. And some of the material on here is kind of standard Clifford Brown, Max Roach, Emersy recordings of that day. Jordu's on here, I Can't Get Started With You, I Get a Kick Out of You, Parisian Thoroughfare. So some of those songs are on his Emersy recordings. So it's probably contemporaneous with some of that Emersy tracking from '54. Interesting cover. Somewhat of that era for sure. There's a green cover. That's volume 2 of this, if I remember. Could be volume 1. I think it's volume 2. But it's GNP number 7. They have about 10 inches on their discography before they went to the LP format. It's a pretty good recording, and you can hear the power of Clifford. Harold Land's fantastic. It's a 10-inch worth tracking down. It did receive an LP reissue with both of these volumes a few years later on the 12-inch LP format with a different cover, a much less interesting cover, if I may offer. But fantastic Clifford Max Roach stuff from the West Coast. A piece of, if you ever stumble on it, you should definitely grab. Now, Buddy Colette, we talked about quite a bit lately. We talked about the album of his in Paris on Specialty. And I pulled this out also from the West Coast on the Challenge label, which was another small West Coast label that didn't exist for a long time. Colette again plays the alto, the tenor, the clarinet, as you can see him laying there with a host of instruments. As I was mentioning in the last episode with that Specialty record, Colette was a master arranger, master composer, a great player, and he ends up in the Hollywood scene. This is yet another example of one of his recordings that you can probably find that in a record store for $5, and it's an incredible testament to a great period in jazz that was post-bebop, but he wasn't really hard bop school either. He had hints of Ellington, bigger compositional arrangements, but the guy swings, and he really is a fundamental piece in the understanding of the building blocks of this great empire called jazz. And so many people today know nothing about Buddy Colette. And yet they think of themselves as big jazz fans because they have 12 Lee Morgan records. And Lee Morgan is important, but there's so many other artists that need to be documented and recognized and remembered. Their legacies are as important. And Colette is certainly a figure that deserves far more recognition today. Also on the Challenge label, a guy we also mentioned last episode, Jerry Wiggins, The King and I, which was a musical of that day, probably a Broadway production first. The modern jazz renditions of The King and I, the Gerald Wiggins Trio. I think Eugene Wright plays bass on this, if I remember. Yeah, and Bill Douglas on the drums. And it's fantastic trio setting. I mean, the cover's a little bit funny, for lack of a better word, but it certainly captures the theatrical aspects of The King and I. But this is great jazz again, once again, by another great player, Wiggins, who's completely underappreciated. And Wiggins, my friend Jean-Michel from Switzerland, he was quick to offer that Wiggins is on par with Hank Jones in terms of his importance and his ability. And not all of his recording settings gave him that opportunity to be the player that he always wants to be. But that's part of the scenario that you exist in jazz as a black man in America. You sometimes get put in certain settings. On the West Coast, he often ended up in settings that were less than ideal. But a lot of his stuff, especially with him as a leader, is absolutely a fantastic player. And he has a huge volume of work as a sideman. Eddie Lockjaw Davis, this is a weird cover. We have a tenor sax there with a blue teddy bear, puppy dog looking thing. On the King label, King number 599, probably 1957. King out of Cincinnati, eventually relocated to Chicago. King buys Bethlehem. Lockjaw was one of my favorite players. He was a member of the basic group for a number of years, and was never a professionally trained guy who could read music. So he was very much playing from the blues and the gospel and the black church, filled with soul, baked beans, and rice. I mean, he just has a lot of sexuality and joy and emoting in his playing. And his work with Johnny Griffin in the 60s at Riverside is some fantastic display of hard bop and some of the other vernacular. But in his own setting, he often lends to be a bit more rhythm and blues, a bit more soul, almost soul jazz before that was even a thing. Lockjaw is just a really fantastic player. He shows up in several different labels, and he ends up making a long series of recordings for Prestige and eventually for Riverside, like I said. But before that, he makes 5 recordings for the King label, mostly in 57, 58, I think it is. And they're all pretty tough to come by, to be honest. I have them all. Of course, and just a wonderful part of his development as a player. And if I remember, Lockjaw has a recording somewhere before King. It's escaping my mind where. It's at Roost. He does some great work at Roost, 10-inch and an LP. One of those was Sonny Stitt, another guy from that same era who really could blow the blues and bebop. And so Stitt was a fun companion for Lockjaw, and kind of a different sounding player, kind of like Griffin was as well. But Lockjaw's a very important player, and one of my favorites, to be honest. I enjoy most of Lockjaw's material. And Lockjaw, his material's out there for good, affordable pricing almost always. Art Tatum, this is on the Clef label. Norman Granz signs Art Tatum. And Norman Granz's mind, that was one of his big signings, a coup almost, if you will, like Ella Fitzgerald. He knew Tatum was an absolute legend and a giant of a player, and really unrivaled on the keyboard. His technical prowess, his nimble virtuosity, his ability to play things from memory or hearing them once. He was just an anomaly that really is unrivaled in jazz history. And you have your boogie woogie players out of Chicago, and you have your stride players out of Harlem. But Tatum's really his own entity. And his virtuosity, his long lyrical lines, his use of alternate melody, and the way he shifts a lot of the sounds and tones and uses parts of the scale that most people wouldn't have even thought to incorporate. A lot of it's a precursor to what bebop brings to the table. And there's a story of Parker coming to New York as a young man, looking to establish himself, and he ends up getting a job washing dishes, if I remember, in a place where Tatum had a residency. And so hearing Tatum play night after night with those long lyrical lines and endlessly flowing ideation that just connects various streams and rivers, Tatum is a very unique specimen. No one really quite is in his vernacular. And so some would say he's one of the real roots of bebop, one of the real foundational pieces. And of course, when you're influencing a guy like Parker, that's not a leap by any means. But Granz got the chance to sign Tatum in the early 50s, and they record, I think, 10 volumes of stuff. I think most of it's in trio settings, if I remember. Probably with, I can't remember who's on this, to be honest. But I played this like a week ago, twice through both sides. And it's just an incredible, again, there's I think 10 volumes to this that Granz records on the Clef label. And I think it probably gets all reissued on Verve as well, if memory serves. Great DSM cover, of course. Tatum is one of those guys that you can find his records for not too much. And his earlier recordings for like Decca and some of the other labels, Columbia, I mean, they're noteworthy. And his virtuosity is always omnipresent. But it's really those Clef recordings, I think, that people should really try to find, because it gave them the setting of a lot of freedom musically. Granz was one of those guys who really put people in their own strongest suit. We don't want you wearing something you don't feel comfortable in. This is probably the first record I played a week and a half ago for this set of records, the Jazz Crusaders, Tough Talk. Some fantastic trombone work on here. I'm a pretty big fan of this group. Wayne Henderson is the bone player, of course. Sticks Hooper on the drums. Wilton Felder on the tenor. Robert Haynes on the bass, and Joe Sample on the piano. Some of those guys had pretty big careers of their own in the 70s and 80s, like Sample, of course, did. But the Crusaders originally were out of Texas, if I remember, and then they went to the West Coast. And they record a fairly long series of recordings for Pacific Jazz, mostly in the P series, flip by 59, 60, 61, 62. And then they end up getting more into kind of a crossover sound a little bit later. By the time the 70s roll around, they're doing very much a fusion thing, much like what the Joe Sample stuff was doing as well. But these early recordings on Pacific are a testament to an early version of, once again, kind of a soul jazz. They're not really West Coast. They're not really cool. They're not really hard bop. They're not cool bop. They're definitely kind of Texas barbecue, blues based, grooving. Like I said, almost proto soul jazz in a way. These guys really cook. And again, Pacific Jazz Crusaders stuff, you can find these records for 10, 15 bucks in great condition and have yourself an important part of the jazz history. And again, something that's probably not going to be reissued anytime soon. It's it's amazing how many people overlook so much great used jazz. And I won't go down that road again, but it's just funny to me how many people are passing up great used records in order to buy a couple new reissues for 40 bucks. For 80 bucks for 2 new records, you can often buy 5 or 6 old vintage pressings of less known people and come away with more jazz knowledge. And ultimately, jazz knowledge is kind of what you're after, isn't it? Understanding the body of the work. And it should be what you're after, not just the, hey, look at me, I got this too now. Which it feels like a lot of that's what it is an echo chamber of, oh, I need to have that because everyone else has it. Beverly Kenny, a great singer. A lot of blues for a white gal, if I'm honest. A lot of pain. And she had some mental health issues, and she wasn't long for this life. She killed herself in a New York hotel room, I think in 57. And so a tragic end. She's backed by Basseyites here, Joe Newman, Frank West, Eddie Jones, Freddie Green, Joe Jones. So I mean, what a setting to have yourself recording Bassie's greats. The rhythm section, plus Newman and West. Really a fantastic, Freddie Green on the guitar. Fantastic stuff. So it's got that good pocket swing going behind her, and she's got a wonderful voice and does really smooth, sweet renditions of standards. And again, with that great group behind them, how can they not swing? How can they not be everything you're looking for in a jazz vocal session? After her 3 Roost albums, she works with Johnny Smith at Roost, and she works with another Ralph Burns or someone else at Roost. Then she moves on to Decca, makes a couple of recordings there, which are a little more pop vernacular, but they're still good. But her Roost recordings are actually really, really fantastic. Teddy Reed documents her voice and recognizes how much of a talent she was. A record I probably played for almost a day and a half. I just kept playing it over and over, Red Garland. I'm a huge Red Garland guy. I love his body of work. All his trio setting stuff to me is just what most people I think who don't know jazz would love about jazz. And that's why I think it's so frustrating. There's so many people out there preaching the gospel of jazz, but they're preaching a sermon that oftentimes should come much further down the road. I mean, Fire and Brimstone and the Book of Revelations shouldn't be beginner preaching. You should start with some joy and some happiness and celebration and some of the positivity of your belief system. And I think most people aren't looking for the honking of Pharoah Sanders and John Coltrane. I think most people want to have something that feels romantic and elegant and sophisticated and modern and not rigid, which I find a lot of European classical music is. It's very rigid and stifling and has very little breath in it. Jazz bubbles with life, and it doesn't have to be this intense, ear-shrieking experience for jazz to be bubbling and full of life. And Garland articulates the blues, and his covers of standards are always wonderful examples of what jazz is. Jazz is a remixing of standard songs that makes them swing, it makes them a little bit more sexual, a little more sensual, a little bit more romantic, a little bit more danceable. And Garland's just that architect. He really knows how to play with minimal ferocity. He doesn't need to be explosive and all over the keyboard. So in some ways, he's kind of the opposite of a guy like Art Tatum or Oscar Peterson, where he doesn't need to be this dynamic string of notes, which, I mean, he can do that at times. And you'll see, he was, of course, with Miles Davis for a number of years. And so he has the capacity to be a very strong soloist. But he also has a great sense of an ear for the ballad and melody and tonality and rhythm and pulse. And of course, He also had a drug habit, which is partly why Miles replaced him with Wynton Kelly at another point. And Kelly was one of the great rhythm players of this music as well. But I find Red Garland's body of work, both at Prestige and his work at Riverside Jazzland, I mean, it's just, even later into the 70s, he makes just great traditional jazz records throughout his lifetime. Huge fan of Red Garland. And again, that sensitivity to melody, that sensitivity to articulation, that sensitivity to even the lyric. When you're not a singer, you can still be sensitive to the lyric. And Garland's always that. George Braith. This is on Blue Note, number 4161, so probably 1964, maybe 63. Braith was a tenor player who kind of forged his own horn. He actually would fuse several horns together so they could be played simultaneously, and he called it a Braithophone, which he actually, I believe, even patented. I'm not sure, but it was called a Braithophone. And so he could play multiple horns at once, creating a chordal sound. And it has a weird tonality to it that's very unique and a bit fuzzy, and it's kind of warm, slightly dissonant at times. You have a great rhythm section here with Grant Green, Billy Gardner, and Hugh Walker. This is an old pressing. It's actually got a bit of a warp in it, but it plays through actually fairly well in spite of that warpage. Cool cover. Classic Reed Miles design, the minimal font, sans serif font, a nice photograph. Braith was a pretty forgotten player in a lot of ways. It was a really enjoyable listen. It's got elements of soul jazz, a little bit of out in it, but it stays very accessible. Here's the great Jimmy Hamilton now, and this is on the Urania label, a small New York label that exists in 53, 54, does a few 10 inches, Jack Teagarden kind of stuff, some really Coleman Hawkins stuff. And then as the LP era comes, they kind of reissue that stuff and do a few more recordings. There's 2 Jimmy Hamilton recordings here on Urania on LP. There's number 1208. And the number 12 was a common sequence number for early LP jazz runs because, of course, the new format was the 12-inch. So 1208 would often indicate this was the 12-inch format, number 8, which is for Pacific, for Atlantic, for a lot of labels. That number, that 1200 sequence, was a predominant number sequence. But Jimmy Hamilton plays clarinet with Ellington for a long time. And he's one of the great voices of the clarinet, fusing swing era dynamics with modern sound and composition. He comes into this smaller group era. He doesn't get a ton of work as a leader, but he's really an important piece of the Ellington groups and really a fantastic player. Both his Urania recordings are really, really, really excellent, and they're actually becoming more expensive and tougher to come by. It's a cool cover. He has a couple of recordings as well on Prestige, on Swingsville label, if I recall. Also pretty tough to come by. He's, for a guy that's kind of unknown, his records do seem to fetch decent money, and the people who know. And the clarinet definitely falls into disuse by the 60s. And even the 50s, it's a much less preeminent instrument in jazz. And it's interesting watching a lot of the great instruments in jazz fall into disuse into the 60s. By the time the 60s comes along, trombone players become much rarer, especially new players arriving on the scene. And there's a few, but it's not like in the swing era where there was hundreds of trombone players everywhere that were of importance. Clarinet definitely fades out of the picture. Even the trumpet, by the 60s into the 70s, new trumpet players are becoming much less frequent, and the saxophone and the guitar and the organ start really taking over the vernacular and speaking the language of jazz predominantly. But the clarinet really is a wonderful tonal instrument that can be dynamic and full of pulse and energy, and the bass clarinet's also wonderful, which I'll mention here again in a minute. But Hamilton's a great player. Those records, if you stumble on them across on them, records store for under 40, 50 bucks, they're worth grabbing. They're really, really fantastic. This record I played for a friend the other day. The story came up of Miles Davis and how difficult a person he was, and how he wasn't this great band leader that he's often given credit for being. And the story of this record, of course, is how he abandons his band in L.A. Kenny Drew, Paul Chambers, Philly Joe Jones, and John Coltrane. And they're kind of stuck in L.A. without plane tickets home, without money to get home. Miles just left them. And Paul Chambers knew a friend who worked at the Imperial label, might have even been the owner of the label, and he convinces Imperial to record a session so they can make money and to get back home, back out east. And it's been reissued on several other imprints, including Score and Jazz West, which were all affiliated with the Imperial label. But beautiful, beautiful record, beautiful quartet. Kenny Drew is really fantastic on this. And when they get back out east, Kenny Drew quits Miles' groups and gives him a nice punch to the face. So there's your hero, Miles Davis, once again being the asshole that he really was. A fantastic record. Again, I'm playing with a friend the other day. We were talking about great jazz singers that are forgotten. And he's like, I'm not the biggest into jazz vocalists. And so we were talking about various jazz singers, and this record, again with Gerald Wiggins, is fantastic. Chico Hamilton's on the drums. A guy by the name of Jim Wolfe is on the bass. And of course, the great guitar player Howard Roberts is just wonderful on this. And I've talked about this record numerous times. This is the great Pinky Winters. She records for the Vantage label out of the West Coast. This is Argo out of Chicago. And this has another cover as well, but this is the original cover, number 604. So it was the fourth LP released by Argo. And Argo doesn't have a 10-inch sequence. They kind of arrive in the LP era. She has an amazing amount of blues in her for a white gal. I mean, just going to say it like it is. You wouldn't even think really right off the bat that that's a white gal. She has such an interesting phrasing, and it's like she must have grew up in a poor neighborhood. She understands the black church. She understands phrasing. She understands pausing and singing behind the beat. And she's just really in a wonderful setting here with these West Coast players. And again, Howard Roberts is really a revelation on this. And we always know he was a great player. He ends up with the Wrecking Crew, and he's on hundreds of recordings over the course of his career. But you really hear Howard Roberts in a strong blues jazz setting here, and it's a wonderful expression. Wiggins, of course, is always fantastic. And of course, Pinky is really the star of the show. And this is the old Argo label logo. It took me a long time to track this record down. It can go for hundreds of dollars because it's pretty rare. And some of the early Argos are really rare. And for some reason, that one in particular was really hard to track down. And I finally found it in a Chicago store in Oak Park, just west of downtown. I was in a record store and it was in there. I was like, oh my God, I couldn't believe it. I was so excited. And I got it for a pretty good price, actually. And that was a good day. Now, Marilyn Moore, another great singer who came up in conversation that same day. She was married to the great Al Cohn, one of the great tenor players, the Woody Herman Herds, the Thundering Herd, the four brothers. Cohn's a great player, along with Zoot Sims and Stan Getz and some of those other guys. I'm a huge fan of Al Cohn. His body of work as a leader, whatever label he's on, Bethlehem Dawn. He's really a fantastic player, lyricist, beautiful tone. He plays the melody first and foremost. Probably some of the Lester Young school flowing through him, as a lot of those guys were influenced by Lester. And Lester, of course, was one of the great influences of that era and that generation. Lester's really a huge figure that looms over the tenor saxophone. But Marilyn Moore was married to Al Cohn. And Al Cohn at the time was doing some recording sessions for Billie Holiday. and they became good friends with Billy. And some of the stories I've read says that Billy would actually babysit their child at times. And Marilyn does this recording for Bethlehem, probably 1957. It's a fantastic record, and there's some bass clarinet on this that's just fantastic, played by Al Cohn, actually. Again, it's amazing how much she sounds like Billy. Her inflection, a bit of a nasal tone. She really, at first listen, you would think that's a Billie Holiday recording. I don't know that one. Where's that from? But it's obviously Marilyn Moore. It was her only real recording, if I recall. And she disappears, and I think she went back to kind of raising her kid. And kind of left that stage for the rest of her life, if memory serves. But what a wonderful record that is. If you have the chance to stumble on that somewhere, it's worth the $50 to $100 that it goes for nowadays. This is a Blue Note type recording that was on the Jazz Line, Jazz Time label. And it's got a very Blue Note-esque lineup. It's led by the great Duke Pearson, who was one of the great piano players. He's on the Idle Moments record I talked about last time. He does some fantastic records as a leader for Blue Note. I had them sitting out the other day. I love Pearson's playing. But here he is as a leader, and this record kind of lends itself to the direction that Pearson wanted to go when he returns to Blue Note, into bigger ensembles, bigger arrangements, bigger groups. Here he has the great Donald Byrd, very much a Blue Note alumnus. Johnny Coles, who also played at Blue Note some and made one record there as a leader. And Coles was a fantastic trumpet player, very forgotten today for the most part. And if it wasn't for that one Blue Note he had, he'd probably be very forgotten. Then you have Bob Cranshaw, Walter Perkins, and Duke Pearson in the rhythm section. Hush. And this is a weird reissue of it, but a very hard record to come by. And what a great group. And it's very much a Blue Note, hard bop, that type of direction, that type of intensity, that type of volume and expression. Really a great record with a really, like I said, Blue Note-esque lineup that fits very much into that vernacular of 60, 61, 62. And it was a real enjoyable listen. And review on the back from All Music gives it a 4-star. And I love Pearson's body of work. Great player. Should be remembered in a greater light than he is. But that's true for so many of the great jazz people that existed in that time and era. I think a lot of the jazz universe from 1957, 55, 1960, whatever year you want to pick. If you had showed them 60, 70 years from now who would be remembered and who would be forgotten, I think a lot of them would be shocked by those results. Like, I don't think anybody in 1955 would have predicted that 70 years from now, Miles Davis would be the only name most people remember in jazz. Ain't nobody in the jazz universe in 1955 that would have offered that name. No one. Clifford Brown? Maybe. Parker? Sure. Lester? Possibly. I mean, there's infinite names that would have been issued. Dizzy Gillespie. Infinite names that would have been offered up. If they had to pick one guy that was going to be remembered above all else 60 years down the road, no one would have said Miles Davis. I mean, his ascendancy to his place in jazz royalty today is so undeserved in so many ways. His importance and influence is so over-exaggerated by his fame. His ability, his innovation, his band leading, it's all overinflated. And does he have an important role? Yes. Is he a head and shoulders above the rest of the jazz universe? Not a fucking chance. There's just no definition of jazz from that era that you can express that would make you believe or understand that he is the luminous figure that's going to carry jazz into the next century. It's just not on the landscape. And it still shocks me to this day that he often is seen so heads and shoulders above the crowd by so many, and how so many people have 25 jazz records and 10 of them are Miles Davis records. And it speaks largely to the power of Columbia Records, a label he signed to in 55, that ascended his legacy, and that label still exists today, whereas most of these jazz other greats were on labels that have long since disappeared. And they've been bought up by other bigger labels and kind of lost in the vaults and get reissued here and there. But Miles Davis' name has never left the vernacular. Columbia's always been reissuing live stuff, reissuing box sets, reissuing remixes and stuff, and remasters of stuff. And so anniversary releases. Bitches Brew's been out how many times? Kind of Blue's never gone out of print. Sketches of Space. And so it's all elevated his popularity to this point where he stands heads and shoulders above the jazz world, and it's really undeserved. But that being said, we're going to get back to the point of this episode. What might be the greatest jazz song of all time. And this song swings so hard. It's got these swells and movements and crescendos and diminuendos, and it's just a bombastic, fiery jazz piece that if you put that in a time capsule, 1,000 years from now, someone could open it and be like, ooh, that's some fire. And I was sharing this with a friend the other day, and we actually sat and listened to it together and played it. And he had to agree that, boy, that's really a special piece of music. And if I recall, Louis Prima might have been the original composer of it. Which, Prima was a fantastic New Orleans trumpet player who's now remembered more for the schlock that he did in the 60s on some of those labels with Keely Smith. But he, make no mistake about it, in spite of all that personality and that schlock and those characters he played, and his kind of chauvinistic role he played with women on stage, and he was a showman as much as he was a virtuoso, but he was an incredible player from New Orleans, influenced by Armstrong, a big part of the jazz legacy. He's just kind of seen in a very different light because of what his fame has remembered him for. But Prima was a great player in his infancy. And Benny Goodman takes this song, Sing, 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 and really elevates it to the status of volcanic masterpiece. And the arrangements, the Harry James on the trumpet in this version, Teddy Wilson on the piano, I mean, it's really a bombastic essay on what jazz and swing and dynamism and the capacity for this music to move you. It's incredible in its swells and its movements and its pulsing, and a lot of it feels like modern EDM music just being prepared and done with different instrumentation. So the swells and the counter movements of these lows and these highs and everything moving, and it's a controlled cacophony. It's pulsing, it swings, it moves, it jumps, it's full of energy and full of life. Gene Krupp on the drums is just a bombastic layer down of the funk. And he can minimalize this thing at times to these small little passages of incredible minimalism that still dance with a fury and a fire that is unrivaled. It's unquestionably one of the greatest jazz compositions of all time, and any modern jazz group that wants to cover an incredible piece of music that will move an audience, Sing, 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 will always be that piece. So in closing, I'm not going to say that it's the greatest song in jazz history, because there's infinite great songs. I mean, Ellington composed 35 of the greatest songs ever. But it certainly has the capacity to swing and move any group of people. I'd love to hear someone modern kind of remix it in that type of vernacular, just to hear how well it would translate to the modern world. You asked me on 100 Days, the greatest jazz song, I'll probably give you a different answer 100 times. But, I mean, every time I hear that song, I'm absolutely just moved by its swing, its pulse, its energy. It's really a fun piece. And it's something that you should all have in your collection, once again. And it's an interesting little series here of things I'm going to suggest to people that they probably don't have that they should. And, I mean, there's infinite recordings of that song. And this Goodman version is a live version. And it's incredible. I've heard lots of different versions of it, from Krupa doing it in a trio setting to I mean, really huge ensembles doing it. It never doesn't swing. So anyway, sing, 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 fantastic stuff. Anybody wants to help out the cafe, money's tight. My wife is on the road to recovery, but she's a long ways from ever coming back here. If that ever even happens, I don't know. Money's been tight. Summer bills have been high. It's been slow because people are out of town. I could really use some donations to the Patreon, PayPal. So if you're in the place to help this channel out, this coffee shop out, this jazz archive, this museum, it's just I need to pay the mortgage. Got bills to pay. It's getting a little overwhelming. It's hard to keep my chin up some days when I'm all stressed about money. And in today's political climate, a lot of people just right of the aisle don't want to come in here. They just assume it's some kind of liberal hippie commune. And I mean, there's not really a political conversation going on here most days. I mean, I certainly have my political viewpoints, but this is a business and but the fact that I have a collection of black jazz musicians in here, to a lot of people that makes it political, which is kind of sad. But anyway, so I need people who appreciate what I do and appreciate this collection and appreciate this place to help support the cafe if they can. If I lose this thing, I'll lose my home as well upstairs, and I don't know what's going to happen. So I need to appeal to people once in a while just to help out if you have it. If not, God bless you anyway. And by God, I mean Duke Ellington. Y'all be safe. You have a great day, and we'll see you all soon. Peace.